The morning Catherine Walsh lost everything. She stood in the dirt yard of her ranch watching 6 men dismount their horses like vultures descending on a carcass. The bank representative, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a voice like grinding metal, read from a document he didn't bother to unfold completely. Her cattle, all 214 head, were now property of Mountain West Bank as settlement for debts incurred by her late husband. The words struck her harder than the August sun beating down on Alta, Utah. She had buried Thomas 3 months ago after a riding accident left him with a broken neck, and her with a ranch she didn't know how to run alone. The debts were news to her. Thomas had kept the books, handled the finances, made the deals. She'd managed the household, helped with the branding, ridden fence lines, but the money had always been his domain. Now she understood why he'd grown so quiet in those final months, why worry lines had creased his forehead even when he smiled at her across the dinner table. "Mrs. Walsh, we'll need you to vacate the premises by sundown," the bank man said, folding his document with crisp efficiency. "The property itself will be auctioned next week." Catherine's hands trembled at her sides. She was 24 years old, had been married for 6 years, and in the span of one terrible morning she'd become destitute. The ranch hands had scattered when Thomas died, seeking work with outfits that could actually pay wages. Her nearest neighbor was 5 miles east. She had $43 to her name and a brother in California she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. "Please," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Give me until tomorrow. I just need time to gather my things." The bank man's expression didn't change. "Sundown, Mrs. Walsh. We're not unreasonable people, but business is business." She watched them drive her cattle toward the eastern pasture, where they'd hold them until transport wagons arrived. Each cow represented hours of work, cold mornings, hot afternoons, her husband's sweat, and now his ghost. The Herefords moved reluctantly, bawling their confusion. The men whooped and hollered, treating the whole affair like any other day's work. Catherine walked back to the house on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The cabin Thomas had built stood modest but sturdy, 2 rooms with a loft and a stone fireplace he'd mortared himself. She looked at the table where they'd eaten breakfast that very morning, the coffee cup still sitting where she'd left it. Everything looked the same, but nothing would ever be the same again. She pulled her trunk from beneath the bed and began folding her dresses, her hands moving automatically while her mind spun in desperate circles. Where would she go? The boarding house in town cost money she didn't have. She could try to find work, but Alta was a mining town, and the only jobs for women were cooking, cleaning, or the kind of work that made church ladies cross the street. She'd rather starve. The sound of hoofbeats brought her to the window. A single rider approached from the south, taking the long road that wound up from the main valley. She didn't recognize him, which meant nothing in a territory where strangers outnumbered friends 10 to 1. He sat tall in the saddle, wearing a dark hat and a duster coat despite the heat. His horse was a paint, well-muscled and moving at an easy lope that ate up the ground. Catherine stepped onto the porch, wiping her dusty hands on her apron. The rider drew up near the fence line and dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. When he removed his hat, she saw dark hair and a face that was younger than she'd expected, maybe 27 or 28, weathered by sun and wind but handsome in a rough-hewn way. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Name's Jacob Anderson. I was passing through and saw the bank men driving cattle, wondered if there might be trouble." Something about the directness of his gaze made Catherine straighten her spine. "The trouble's already happened, Mr. Anderson. Those cattle were mine until about an hour ago." He nodded slowly, his gray eyes taking in the ranch, the house, her face. "Debt collection, that's right. Where are they taking the herd? Holding pasture on the Morrison place, I expect. They'll ship them out tomorrow or the next day." She crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "I appreciate your concern, but unless you're here to buy cattle from the bank, I don't see how this involves you." Jacob put his hat back on, tilting it against the sun. "Might be I am here to buy cattle. How many head? 214. But they're prime stock, Mr. Anderson. Herefords. My husband spent 5 years building that herd." Her voice caught slightly on the past tense. "They're worth at least $20 a head, probably more. So about $4,000, give or take." Catherine blinked. Most cowboys she knew could barely count past their monthly wages. This one threw around figures like a bank accountant. "Give or take, not that it matters. I don't have $4,000, I don't have 400. Jacob walked closer, stopping at the base of the porch steps. Up close, she could see the dust on his boots, the wear on his gun belt, the calluses on his hands. A working man then, but something else too. His clothes were well made, his horse was expensive stock, and he carried himself with quiet confidence. "What if I bought them back for you?" he asked. Catherine laughed, a bitter sound that surprised her. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "No, madam, I don't, but I know what it's like to lose something that matters." He looked past her at the house, the barn, the corrals. "This is good land, good water. You could make something here if you had the stock to do it." "I already made something here," Catherine said quietly, "and now it's gone. Doesn't have to be." She studied him, trying to understand the angle. Nobody helped anyone without expecting something in return. "That was the first lesson the frontier taught you. What would you want from me, Mr. Anderson? Because I should tell you right now that I'm not that kind of woman." His expression didn't change. "I'd want a job, a place to work for a spell. I've been riding for 3 years and I'm tired of drifting. If I buy back your cattle, I'd work your ranch as foreman. You'd pay me standard wages when you can, and I'd take room and board until then. When the ranch is back on its feet, I move on." It was too simple, too clean. Catherine shook her head. "I don't believe you. Don't have to believe me. Just have to decide if you want to keep your ranch or lose it." Jacob turned to leave, then paused. "I've got the money, Mrs. Walsh. Made a good strike in Nevada last year and walked away before the claim played out. I've been looking for something to invest in, somewhere to light for a while. This could work for both of us." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. It was insane. Letting a stranger buy back her cattle, work her ranch, live on her property. The gossip alone would destroy what was left of her reputation. But the alternative was losing everything, becoming another widow begging for charity or worse. "How do I know you won't just take the cattle and disappear?" she asked. "You don't." "But if I wanted to steal cattle, madam, I wouldn't ask permission first." He gestured toward the eastern pasture. "Those bank men will be in town by late afternoon. If I ride now, I can catch them before they settle in for supper. By nightfall, your cattle can be back in your pastures. Your choice." Catherine closed her eyes, feeling the sun on her face, the breeze that always came down from the mountains this time of day. Thomas had loved that breeze. He'd said it smelled like freedom and possibility. She wondered what he'd tell her to do, whether he'd trust this stranger with gray eyes and too much money in his pockets. But Thomas was dead, and she was alive, and sometimes survival meant taking risks that would have seemed unthinkable yesterday. "All right," she said, opening her eyes. "Buy back my cattle, Mr. Anderson, but I want a written agreement, something legal that protects us both." Jacob nodded. "Fair enough. I'll stop by the lawyer's office after I visit the bank. We'll have papers drawn up proper." He mounted his paint in one smooth motion and gathered the reins. One more thing, Mrs. Walsh. What are you going to do about the ranch hands? You'll need help working that herd. I'll figure it out. I know 3 men looking for work. Good cowboys, honest. I could send them this way if you're hiring. Catherine almost laughed again. This man who'd appeared out of nowhere was suddenly solving all her problems like some kind of miracle. It still felt wrong, too good to be true, but what choice did she have? Send them, she said. Tell them wages are standard but might be late sometimes. If they can live with that, they've got jobs. Jacob touched his hat brim. I'll be back before dark. Then he wheeled his horse and rode toward town at a ground-eating gallop that kicked up dust devils in his wake. Catherine stood on the porch until he disappeared from view, then she walked back inside and sat down at the table. Her hands were still shaking. She poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, not caring that it had gone cold and bitter. The silence of the house pressed against her ears. What had she just agreed to? Letting a strange man buy her cattle, work her land, sleep in her barn or bunkhouse, or wherever he planned to stay. The church ladies would have a field day. Mrs. Walsh, the widow who took up with some drifter before her husband's grave had even settled. She could already hear the whispers, feel the cold shoulders at the general store, but Catherine had learned something in the 3 months since Thomas died. Survival mattered more than reputation. Food mattered more than gossip. Keeping a roof over her head mattered more than what people said behind her back. She drank her cold coffee and waited. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Catherine cleaned the house because she needed something to do with her hands. She swept floors that didn't need sweeping, scrubbed pots that were already clean, beat rugs until her arms ached. Anything to keep from thinking about what was happening in town. Whether Jacob Anderson would actually return or whether this was all some elaborate joke, she'd been too desperate to see through. Around 4 o'clock, she heard cattle bawling in the distance. Catherine ran to the window, then out onto the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. Her Herefords were coming up the north road, driven by 3 cowboys she didn't recognize and 1 man she did. Jacob Anderson rode at the rear of the herd, keeping the stragglers moving with easy skill. Catherine's knees went weak with relief. She grabbed the porch railing to steady herself, watching as her cattle flowed back into the pastures they'd been driven from that morning. The cowboys worked efficiently, getting the animals settled, closing gates, making sure water troughs were accessible. Jacob dismounted near the barn and spoke with the other men, pointing toward various buildings and corrals. Then he walked toward the house, carrying a leather folder under one arm. "They're all here," he said when he reached the porch. 214 head bought and paid for. The bank was happy to close the deal. They'd rather have cash than cattle any day. Catherine tried to speak but found her throat had closed up. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "How much did you pay?" $3,800. They wanted to get rid of them quick, so I negotiated. He held out the folder. "Papers are in here. Bill of sale, ownership transfer, and our agreement. Lawyer named Thornton drew it up. Everything's legal and proper." She took the folder with trembling hands and opened it. The documents were neatly written in a clerk's precise hand. Bill of sale transferring 214 head of Hereford cattle from Mountain West Bank to Jacob Anderson for the sum of $3,800. A second document transferring ownership of said cattle from Jacob Anderson to Catherine Walsh for the sum of $1 and other valuable considerations. A third document outlining the terms of Jacob's employment as ranch foreman, including wages of $35 per month plus room and board, to be paid when financially feasible, with the understanding that delayed wages would accrue no interest. It was real. It was actually real. "I don't understand," Catherine said softly. You spent almost $4,000 for a job that pays $35 a month. That makes no sense. Jacob leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the ranch. Makes sense to me. I told you, I've been drifting for 3 years. A man gets tired of sleeping on the ground, eating beans from a can, never knowing where he'll be next week. This gives me a place to stay, work that matters, and a stake in something bigger than myself. He glanced at her. Besides, those cattle are yours now, Mrs. Walsh. Papers say so. If I do my job right, this ranch will be profitable again in a year or two. That's worth more than money to me. Catherine's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. She'd cried enough in the past 3 months. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. Jacob straightened and gestured toward the barn. Those 3 men I brought are named Sam Cooper, Dutch Morgan, and Henry Billings. Good cowboys, all of them. They'll want to know where to bunk and what the work schedule looks like. And we'll need to take inventory, see what supplies we're short on, figure out how much hay you've got stored for winter. The practical talk steadied Catherine. This she could handle. Running a household, managing supplies, organizing work. She'd done it for 6 years alongside Thomas. The bunkhouse is behind the barn. It sleeps 6. There's bedding in the storage room and enough provisions in the root cellar for a week if we're careful. I put up 100 tons of hay before Thomas died, but I don't know if that'll be enough. It'll do for a start. We can cut more if we need to. Jacob started toward the barn, then turned back. Where do you want me to bunk? Catherine hadn't thought about it. Having ranch hands was one thing. They had their own quarters, their own space, but Jacob was different. He'd bought her cattle, saved her ranch, tied himself to this place in ways that went beyond a simple employment arrangement. There's a room off the barn, she said. Thomas used it as an office sometimes when he needed to get away from the house. It's got a cot and a stove. Would that work? That'll work fine, madam. He touched his hat brim and walked away, leaving Catherine alone on the porch with a leather folder full of documents that had changed her life in the space of an afternoon. She went inside and read the papers again, carefully, looking for tricks or traps or hidden clauses, but everything was straightforward, legal, binding. Jacob Anderson had spent nearly $4,000 to give her back what the bank had taken, her cattle, her dignity, her future. Catherine set the folder on the table and walked to the window. The sun was dropping toward the western mountains, painting the sky orange and pink. Her cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures. Cowboys moved around the barn and corrals, settling in for their first night on the ranch. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney as someone started a fire for cooking. It looked like home again. That night, Catherine made supper for 5. It felt strange, cooking for men she didn't know, but it also felt right. A working ranch needed working men, and working men needed to be fed. She made beef stew with potatoes and carrots from her garden, biscuits with honey, coffee strong enough to strip paint. When everything was ready, she rang the bell that hung outside the kitchen door. The men came from the bunkhouse and barn, washing up at the pump before filing into the kitchen. They were polite, awkward, removing their hats and standing until she told them to sit. Sam Cooper was the oldest, maybe 40, with weathered skin and kind eyes. Dutch Morgan was younger, stocky and strong with red hair and freckles. Henry Billings couldn't have been more than 20, all lanky limbs and nervous energy. Jacob came last, and Catherine noticed how the other men deferred to him, waiting until he sat before taking their own seats. He'd cleaned up too, changed his shirt, combed his hair back from his face. He looked younger without the dust and trail wear, less like a drifter and more like a rancher. "This looks wonderful, madam," Sam said as Catherine served the stew. "Haven't had a home-cooked meal in longer than I can remember." "Well, You'll have them here as long as you're working for me, Catherine said. I expect you to earn your keep, but I'll feed you proper in return. They ate in relative silence, the way hungry men do, focused on the food in front of them. Catherine sat at the head of the table, the place where Thomas used to sit, and felt the strangeness of it. 4 strange men in her kitchen, eating her food, sleeping on her property. Yesterday morning she'd been alone. Tonight she had a crew. Mr. Anderson tells us you've got 214 head of Herefords, Dutch said, sopping up gravy with a biscuit. That's good stock. Should bring good prices at market. My husband built that herd, Catherine said. He had an eye for quality beef. Said the Herefords were the future of ranching in this territory. He was right about that, Sam agreed. Eastern markets want quality beef and they'll pay for it. You get that herd through winter and to spring market, you'll clear a nice profit. Jacob set down his coffee cup. That's the plan. But we've got work to do first. I rode the property boundaries this afternoon. You've got good grazing land, but some of your fence lines are down. We'll need to repair those before winter or you'll lose cattle to drift. The South Pasture Dam needs work too. And we should probably cull any weak animals before the weather turns. Catherine listened as the men talked about her ranch, making plans, solving problems she hadn't even known existed. It should have felt invasive, like they were taking over. Instead, it felt like relief. She couldn't run this place alone. She'd known that this morning, standing in the yard watching the bank take everything. Now she didn't have to. After supper, the ranch hands returned to the bunkhouse and Catherine cleaned the kitchen. She was drying the last plate when Jacob appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. Need to talk to you about something, he said. Catherine set down the plate. All right. The men are going to have questions about us, about why I bought your cattle, why I'm staying on as foreman. He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable for the first time since she'd met him. I told them you're a widow, that your husband died recently, that you needed help getting back on your feet. They're good men. They won't gossip, but other people will. I know, Catherine said. The church ladies will have me ruined by Sunday. I don't want to make things harder for you. You made things possible for me, Mr. Anderson. I'll deal with the gossip. She met his eyes. Unless you're worried about your own reputation. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I don't have much of a reputation to worry about, madam, but I appreciate the concern. They stood there in the lamplight, the kitchen warm from the stove, the silence stretching between them. Catherine realized she was staring and looked away, busying herself with folding the dish towel. I should turn in, Jacob said. We'll start on the fence lines tomorrow at first light. I'll have breakfast ready at dawn. He nodded and left, and Catherine stood alone in her kitchen, feeling oddly hollow. The day had been a whirlwind of fear and relief, loss and salvation. She should be exhausted. She was exhausted, but sleep felt impossible. She walked through the house, checking windows and doors out of habit. In the bedroom, she stopped in front of the mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at her had dust on her cheeks and circles under her eyes. Her blonde hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in tangles around her face. She looked older than 24. She looked like someone who'd been through hell and come out the other side, scarred but standing. Thomas's photograph sat on the dresser in a silver frame. He'd been a good man, a kind husband, even if he'd hidden his debts from her. Catherine picked up the frame and traced his face with one finger. I don't know if you'd approve of what I did today, she whispered, but I didn't see another choice, and maybe you sent him somehow. Maybe this is your way of looking out for me, even now. She set the photograph down and prepared for bed, moving through the familiar routine of washing her face, brushing her hair, changing into her nightgown. But when she lay down, sleep still wouldn't come. She could hear the cattle lowing in the distance, the wind moving through the pines, the creak of the house settling around her, And somewhere out in the barn, Jacob Anderson was settling into the small room that used to be her husband's retreat. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Catherine rose before dawn to make breakfast. The men ate quickly and headed out to work on fence lines, water systems, building repairs. She spent her days maintaining the house, tending her garden, preparing meals, washing clothes. At night, they all gathered in the kitchen for supper, and the men talked about progress and problems while Catherine listened and learned. Jacob proved to be an excellent foreman. He knew cattle, knew ranching, knew how to manage men without being heavy-handed about it. Sam, Dutch, and Henry responded well to his leadership, working hard and complaining little. The ranch began to take shape again, slowly transforming from a neglected property to a functioning operation. Catherine found herself watching Jacob when she thought he wasn't looking. The way he moved, confident and economical. The way he talked to the horses, gentle and patient. The way he looked at her ranch like he could see what it might become if given the chance. He was different from Thomas, quieter, more contained. Thomas had been outgoing, quick to laugh, the kind of man who made friends easily. Jacob held himself apart, friendly but never familiar, helpful but never intrusive. One afternoon, in early September, Catherine was hanging laundry when Jacob rode up to the house. He dismounted and approached with his hat in his hands, which usually meant he had bad news. "What is it?" Catherine asked, clothespins between her teeth. "We need to talk about winter supplies. I inventoried what you've got stored and it won't be enough. Not for 5 people and not for the cattle if we get a hard winter." Catherine removed the clothespins and faced him. "How short are we? We need more hay, more grain for the horses, more flour and beans and coffee for the house. Salt pork, sugar, medicine for the animals. And we should probably stock up on lamp oil and firewood." He shifted his weight. "I know money's tight, but if we don't prepare now, we'll be in trouble come January. How much will it cost? $200, give or take, maybe more if prices have gone up." Catherine did the math in her head. She had $43. Jacob's wages were accruing at $35 per month, which meant she already owed him $105 she couldn't pay. The other 3 men were owed the same. She was going deeper into debt with every passing day. "I can't afford it," she said quietly. "Not right now, maybe in the spring after we sell the calves." Jacob put his hat back on. "I can advance you the money, take it out of my future wages. You've already spent almost $4,000 on this ranch. I can't ask you to spend more." "You're not asking, I'm offering." He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Walsh, I've got money sitting in a bank in Salt Lake City doing nothing but collecting dust. Let me use it for something that matters. You can pay me back when the ranch is profitable, or not at all if it never is. Either way, we need those supplies." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I won't be a charity case, Mr. Anderson. You're not charity. You're an employer who's hit a rough patch. That's different." His expression softened slightly. "Look, I know you're proud. I respect that. But pride won't keep us fed if we run out of food in February. Let me help." She wanted to argue to tell him no, to prove she could manage on her own, but the truth was she couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The ranch was in deeper trouble than she'd realized, and without Jacob's help, it would fail no matter how hard she worked. "All right," she said, the words tasting bitter. "But I want it documented. Another legal paper saying I owe you the money and will pay it back with interest." "No interest." "With interest," Catherine insisted. "I'm not taking charity and I'm not taking advantage of your generosity. If you loan me money, it's a business transaction." "Understood," Jacob nodded slowly. "Understood. I'll ride into town tomorrow and wire Salt Lake City for the funds. Should have the money by end of week." He walked back to his horse, and Catherine returned to hanging laundry, her hands shaking slightly. She was now in debt to Jacob Anderson for nearly $4,000 plus whatever he spent on winter supplies. If the ranch failed, she'd never be able to repay him. She'd be beholden to him for the rest of her life. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt oddly comforting. Jacob wasn't the kind of man who'd use her debt as leverage. She'd learned that much about him in the weeks he'd been working for her. He was honest, straightforward, honorable in ways that were rare out here. If she owed him money for 10 years, he'd wait 10 years without complaint. That night after supper, Catherine sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become her favorite time of day, these quiet moments between work and sleep when the world felt peaceful. She heard footsteps and turned to see Jacob climbing the porch steps, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "Thought you might want some," he said, offering her one. "Thank you." Catherine took the cup, warming her hands around it. The nights were getting cooler now, fall creeping down from the mountains. "Sit if you want. I won't bite." Jacob smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and sat on the railing. "Didn't think you would, madam." "You can call me Catherine, or Kathy if you prefer. All this madam business makes me feel like somebody's grandmother." "Catherine, then." He sipped his coffee. "Mind if I ask you something personal? Depends on what it is. How long were you married?" Catherine traced the rim of her cup with one finger. 6 years. I was 18 when we wed, fresh off a wagon train from Missouri. Thomas was 21, working as a ranch hand for the Morrison outfit. We met at a church social and he proposed 3 months later. "Were you happy?" It was an intimate question, one she probably shouldn't answer. But there was something about sitting on the porch in the fading light that made honesty feel easier. "Most of the time, yes. Thomas was a good man. Kind. Hardworking. He had dreams about building something that would last, and I believed in those dreams." She paused. "But he had demons, too. Gambling debts he never told me about. Business deals that went bad. I thought we were building a future together, but he was digging a hole beneath our feet. I didn't find out until after he died. That must have been hard." "It was. Still is." Catherine looked at Jacob. "What about you? You ever been married?" "No, madam. I mean, Catherine. Came close once down in Texas. Girl named Mary Ann. Pretty as a picture and sweet as honey. But I wanted to see the world and she wanted to stay home. We went our separate ways." "You regret it?" Jacob considered the question. "Sometimes. But I've seen things I never would have seen if I'd stayed in Texas. Done things that mattered. Maybe that's worth more than settling down young." "And now, you're settling down here, at least for a while. Do you miss the drifting?" "Not as much as I thought I would." He looked out at the ranch, the cattle grazing in the distance, the mountains rising against the darkening sky. "This feels good. Solid. Like I'm building something instead of just moving through." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking their coffee, watching the last light fade from the sky. Catherine felt something shift inside her, some wall she'd built after Thomas died beginning to crack. Jacob was easy to be around. Easy to talk to. He didn't push or pry, didn't demand anything she wasn't willing to give. He just existed beside her, steady and patient, like the mountains themselves. "I should get inside," Catherine said, though she didn't particularly want to. "Morning comes early." "That it does." Jacob stood and took her empty cup. "Sleep well, Catherine." "You too, Jacob." His name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in ways that Mr. Anderson never had. She watched him walk back toward the barn, his figure disappearing into the shadows, and realized with a start that she liked having him here. Not just because he'd saved her ranch, but because he made the loneliness more bearable. The thought frightened her. It was too soon. Thomas had only been dead 3 months. What kind of woman developed feelings for another man so quickly? The church ladies would have a name for it, and none of them would be kind. Catherine pushed the thoughts away and went inside to prepare for bed. But that night, as she lay in the darkness, she couldn't stop thinking about gray eyes and quiet strength and a man who'd appeared out of nowhere to give her back her life. By late September, the ranch was in better shape than it had been in months. The fence lines were repaired, the dam was fixed, and the cattle were thriving on good grass and clean water. Jacob had taken Catherine to town to purchase winter supplies, and the root cellar was now stocked with enough food to see them through until spring. The men had cut extra hay and stacked it in neat rows behind the barn. Everything was ready for winter. Catherine should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt restless. She found herself thinking about Jacob constantly. The way he looked at first light, checking on the cattle with his coffee in hand. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, like her words mattered. The way his hands moved when he worked, capable and sure. The way he smiled, rare but genuine, transforming his serious face into something younger and more open. It was wrong. She knew it was wrong, but knowing didn't make the feelings go away. One Saturday morning, Jacob announced he was riding into Alta to pick up supplies and asked if Catherine needed anything from town. She said yes without thinking, then immediately regretted it. Going into town with Jacob would fuel gossip that was already running wild. Mrs. Walsh and that cowboy foreman of hers, traveling together like they were married. Sitting together on a wagon seat for the 2-hour ride each way. People would talk, but Catherine was tired of caring what people thought. She put on her good dress, pinned up her hair and climbed onto the wagon seat beside Jacob. The ride into town was pleasant. The morning was cool and clear, with aspens turning gold on the mountainsides. Jacob kept the team at an easy pace, letting them enjoy the scenery. They talked about nothing important. The weather, the cattle, plans for spring branding, comfortable conversation between two people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Alta was bustling when they arrived. The mining operations were in full swing, and the town had grown considerably since Catherine's last visit. New buildings lined the main street. Wagons clogged the roads. Men hurried between the saloons and supply stores, their pockets full of silver from the mines. Jacob helped Catherine down from the wagon, his hands strong around her waist. The contact lasted only a second, but Catherine felt it like a brand. She stepped back quickly, smoothing her skirts. "I need to stop at the general store," she said. "Then maybe the seamstress shop. Where will you be?" "Feed store, then the blacksmith. I'll meet you back here in an hour." Catherine agreed and walked toward the general store, acutely aware of the eyes watching her. Two women stood outside the milliner's shop, and their conversation stopped abruptly as Catherine passed. She kept her head high, refusing to show that it bothered her. Inside the general store, she gathered her purchases. Thread, buttons, lamp wicks, tea. Simple things. The proprietor, Mr. Henderson, was polite but distant, not like he used to be when Thomas was alive. Catherine paid for her items and left, feeling the weight of judgment pressing against her shoulders. She was walking toward the seamstress shop when she nearly collided with a woman coming out of the bank. The woman was well-dressed, in her 40s, with elaborate hair and cold blue eyes. Mrs. Margaret Davies, the mayor's wife and the most influential woman in Alta. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, her voice like ice. "How surprising to see you in town." "Mrs. Davies." Catherine nodded politely. "I'm picking up supplies, so I see, and I hear you have quite the establishment now. 4 men working your ranch, all of them young and unmarried." Her smile was poisonous. It must be so comforting having such attentive employees. Catherine's jaw tightened. "They're ranch hands, Mrs. Davies. They work hard and conduct themselves appropriately." "I'm sure they do. Although I must say it does seem irregular. a young widow living alone with 4 strange men. People do talk. Then perhaps people should mind their own business. Mrs. Davies's eyes narrowed. Be careful, Mrs. Walsh. Reputation is everything in a community like ours. Lose it, and you'll find yourself very much alone. She swept past, leaving Catherine standing on the boardwalk with her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. The threat was clear. Conform to what was expected or be ostracized. Never mind that she was working herself half to death to save her ranch. Never mind that she'd lost her husband and nearly lost everything else. None of that mattered. Only appearances mattered. Only propriety. Catherine walked back to the wagon, no longer interested in the seamstress shop. Jacob was already waiting, leaning against the side with his arms crossed. He straightened when he saw her face. What happened? Nothing. Just ran into Mrs. Davies. She made her opinions about my living situation quite clear. Catherine climbed onto the wagon seat without waiting for help. Can we go? Jacob loaded his purchases and climbed up beside her. He didn't speak, just gathered the reins and turned the team toward home. They'd gone a mile outside of town when he finally broke the silence. If my being at the ranch is causing you trouble, I can leave. The other men too. We can find work elsewhere. No. The word came out sharper than Catherine intended. No, you're not leaving. You saved my ranch, Jacob. I'm not going to run you off because some self-righteous busybody doesn't approve of my choices. I don't want to make your life harder. Catherine turned to look at him. You've made my life possible. There's a difference. She took a breath. I know people are talking. I know what they're saying. Widow Walsh taking up with that handsome cowboy before her husband's even cold in the ground, but I don't care anymore. Let them talk. At least I'll still have a roof over my head and food on my table. Jacob's hands tightened on the reins. For what it's worth, you're the strongest woman I've ever met. What you've done these past 3 months, keeping this ranch together, that takes real courage. Something warm bloomed in Catherine's chest. Thank you. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Warmer, more intimate. When they reached the ranch, Jacob helped her down from the wagon, and this time his hands lingered at her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and Catherine saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. He liked her. Not just as an employer or a friend, but as a woman. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt inevitable. October brought the first snow, dusting the mountains white and sending cold winds down into the valley. The cattle grew their winter coats and bunched together in the lee of the hills. The ranch hands spent their days checking on the herd, breaking ice on water troughs, making sure no animals strayed too far from shelter. Catherine and Jacob developed a routine. Every evening after supper, they'd sit on the porch with coffee, talking about the day's work. Sometimes Sam or Dutch or Henry would join them, but more often it was just the two of them, watching the stars come out and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Those conversations grew more personal as the weeks passed. Jacob told her about his childhood in Texas, growing up on a small farm with 3 brothers and a sister. About his father who died when Jacob was 15, leaving him to help run the farm. About leaving home at 20 to seek his fortune, riding north through Indian Territory and Kansas and Nebraska, before finally reaching the Rocky Mountains. Catherine told him about Missouri, about her family's wagon train journey west, about losing her mother to cholera and her father to grief a year later, about meeting Thomas and thinking she'd finally found stability, only to discover it was built on sand. They talked about dreams and regrets, fears and hopes, the kinds of things you only share with someone you trust completely. And gradually, without either of them meaning for it to happen, The distance between them began to close. One evening in late October, Catherine was washing dishes when Jacob came into the kitchen carrying a broken harness that needed mending. He sat at the table working on the leather while she cleaned up from supper. "Can I ask you something?" Catherine said, wiping down the counter. "Sure." "Why did you really buy back my cattle? The truth this time?" Jacob's hand stilled on the harness. "I told you the truth." "You told me part of the truth, but there's more, isn't there?" Catherine turned to face him. "Nobody spends $4,000 out of kindness, not even you." He set down the harness and met her eyes. "You really want to know?" "Yes." Jacob stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark ranch. "I had a sister, younger than me by 4 years. When I left home, she was 16 and engaged to a local farmer. Good man, stable, everything my father would have wanted for her. I thought she'd be fine." His voice roughened. "A year after I left, the farm failed. Drought took the crops, creditors took the land. Sarah's husband tried to hold on, but he couldn't. He shot himself in the barn one morning, and Sarah was left alone with 2 babies and nowhere to go." Catherine's breath caught. "Jacob." "She wrote me letters begging for help, but I was in Nevada, chasing silver, too caught up in my own life to pay attention. By the time I got home, she was dead. Worked herself to death trying to feed those babies, living in a shack that wasn't fit for animals." He turned back to Catherine, his eyes haunted. "So when I saw you standing on that porch, watching the bank take everything you'd worked for, I saw Sarah. And I thought, maybe I can't save my sister, but I can save someone else's." Catherine crossed the room and took his hands in hers. "I'm so sorry. I should have been there for her. Should have sent money or come home or done something, but I didn't, and she paid the price." His fingers closed around Catherine's. "That's why I bought your cattle, not charity, penance. You didn't kill your sister, her circumstances did. I could have changed her circumstances. I had the money, I just didn't care enough to use it." Catherine squeezed his hands. "You care now. That has to count for something." She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how warm his hands felt wrapped around hers. "Thank you for telling me." Jacob's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. For a moment, Catherine thought he might kiss her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, anticipation and fear warring in her chest. It was too soon. It wasn't soon enough, but Jacob stepped back, releasing her hands. "I should go, early morning tomorrow." "Of course." Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. "Sleep well." He left, and Catherine stood alone in the kitchen, still feeling the ghost of his touch on her hands. Something had shifted tonight. Something fundamental. They'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross, acknowledged feelings they couldn't unfeel. The question was, what would they do about it? November came with heavy snows and bitter cold. The ranch hands spent most of their time simply keeping the cattle alive, hauling hay to the pastures, breaking ice, checking for frozen animals. It was brutal work, exhausting and endless. One morning, Sam came back from checking the north pasture with bad news. 3 cows were missing, probably wandered off during the night's blizzard. Jacob immediately organized a search party, and despite Catherine's protests, she saddled her mare and joined them. They rode into the teeth of the storm, snow driving into their faces hard enough to sting. Visibility was almost zero. Catherine could barely see Jacob riding ahead of her, and the other men were just shadows in the white chaos. But they pressed on, knowing that if they didn't find those cows soon, they'd freeze to death. After 2 hours of searching, Dutch spotted tracks heading toward the canyon. They followed them into a narrow ravine, where they found the 3 cows huddled against a rock face, already covered in snow. The animals were still alive, but barely. Getting them out was treacherous work. The ravine floor was icy, and the sides were too steep for the cattle to climb. Jacob finally rigged a rope harness and they dragged the cows one at a time back to open ground, all of them slipping and struggling in the snow. By the time they got the cattle back to the ranch, Catherine was so cold she could barely feel her hands. Jacob practically carried her into the house and set her by the stove, wrapping blankets around her shoulders. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice rough with worry. "You could have frozen to death out there." "So could you," Catherine shot back, teeth chattering. "Besides, they're my cattle, my responsibility." "Your responsibility is staying alive." Jacob knelt in front of her, chafing her hands between his own. "What good are you to this ranch if you're dead?" Catherine started to answer, but the words died when she saw his face. He wasn't angry. He was terrified. The realization sent warmth flooding through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I just wanted to help. I know." Jacob's hands stilled on hers. "I know." They stayed like that for a long moment, kneeling by the fire, hands clasped, eyes locked. Then Jacob leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was afraid she'd push him away. But Catherine didn't push. She leaned into the kiss, her hands coming up to frame his face, her lips parting under his. Heat flooded through her, melting the last of the cold, making her forget everything except the feel of his mouth on hers. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I shouldn't have done that," Jacob said, though he didn't move away. "Why not?" "Because you're my employer. Because your husband just died. Because people will talk." He touched her face. "Because you deserve better than a drifter with $4,000 and no prospects." Catherine caught his hand and pressed it against her cheek. "What I deserve is someone who sees me, really sees me, not as a widow or a charity case or a scandal, but as a person. You see me, Jacob." "I do," he admitted. "God help me, I do." "Then stop apologizing." Catherine kissed him again, harder this time, letting all the loneliness and fear and desperate hope of the past 4 months pour into it. Jacob responded immediately, his arms coming around her, pulling her close. They stayed wrapped together by the fire while the storm raged outside, kissing like teenagers, holding each other like drowning people hold driftwood. Nothing was resolved. All the problems still existed. But for a few stolen minutes, none of it mattered. Eventually, they pulled apart. Jacob rested his forehead against Catherine's, his breathing unsteady. "This complicates things," he said. Catherine laughed shakily. "Things were already complicated. Fair point." He pulled back, studying her face. "What do you want to do?" It was a loaded question. What did she want? To keep kissing him, to push him away and pretend this never happened, to throw caution to the wind and damn the consequences. "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "I just know I don't want to lose you. You won't lose me." Jacob stood and helped her to her feet. "I'm not going anywhere, Catherine. Whether we do this or not, I'm staying until your ranch is stable. I gave you my word." "I know, but I don't want you to stay out of obligation. I want you to stay because you want to." "I do want to," he said quietly, "more than I've wanted anything in a long time." The door burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and Dutch Morgan. "Jacob, we've got a problem. One of the cows we brought in is down and she's not getting up. Looks like pneumonia." The spell was broken. Jacob grabbed his coat and followed Dutch out into the storm. Catherine stood by the fire, touching her lips, feeling the warmth that still lingered there. Everything had changed. Nothing had changed. They'd crossed a line they could never uncross, and Catherine wasn't sorry. The cow died that night despite their best efforts. It was a loss they couldn't really afford, but Jacob said it could have been worse. They could have lost all 3. Catherine tried to take comfort in that, but the dead animal felt like a bad omen. Winter was only beginning and they'd already lost 1 cow. How many more would die before spring? In the days that followed, she and Jacob were careful around each other. They didn't kiss again, didn't touch beyond what was necessary, but the awareness was always there, humming between them like a plucked string. The other men noticed. Catherine caught Sam watching them with knowing eyes more than once. One evening after supper, Sam asked to speak with Catherine privately. They walked out to the porch, where the cold bit through their coats. "I don't mean to overstep, madam," Sam said. "But I wanted you to know that whatever's happening between you and Jacob, it's none of my business. Dutch and Henry feel the same way. You're both adults, and you've both earned the right to make your own choices." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Nothing's happening, Sam. Maybe not yet." "But it will," Sam smiled kindly. "I've been around long enough to recognize two people dancing around feelings they're afraid to admit, and I want you to know that when you stop dancing, you'll have our support. Jacob's a good man, best I've worked for. And you're a good woman who's been through hell. If you find a little happiness together, well, I can't think of two people who deserve it more." Catherine's throat tightened. "Thank you. Just be careful. Not everyone's going to be as understanding as us ranch hands." Sam tipped his hat and went inside, leaving Catherine alone with the cold and her thoughts. He was right. She and Jacob were dancing around feelings that grew stronger every day, and eventually they'd have to stop dancing and face what was between them. December brought a brief thaw that turned the snow to slush and made everything muddy. Catherine used the break in the weather to ride into Alta for church services. She went alone, knowing it would cause less gossip than if Jacob accompanied her. The service was uncomfortable. People whispered behind their hands, shooting Catherine sidelong glances. After the final hymn, most of the congregation filtered out quickly, avoiding her as if widowhood were contagious. Only two women approached her. The first was Mary Chen, whose husband ran the laundry. She was younger than Catherine, maybe 20, with kind eyes and a quick smile. "Mrs. Walsh, I just wanted to tell you that I think you're very brave," Mary said quietly. "Running that ranch on your own, keeping it going after everything you've been through, that takes real strength." "Thank you, Mary. That means more than you know." The second woman was older, perhaps 60, with gray hair and a sturdy build. Catherine recognized her as Helen Winters, a widow herself who ran a boarding house on the edge of town. "Don't you let these church hens peck at you," Helen said bluntly. "They've got nothing better to do than criticize women who actually work for a living. I've heard the talk about you and your foreman, and my response is, so what? You're a widow, not a nun. If you've found someone who treats you well, hold on to him and tell everyone else to mind their own business." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Winters. Call me Helen. And if you ever need a friend, you know where to find me." She squeezed Catherine's arm and walked away, leaving Catherine feeling less alone than she had in months. On the ride back to the ranch, Catherine made a decision. Life was too short and too hard to waste time worrying about what other people thought. If she had feelings for Jacob and he had feelings for her, then they deserved a chance to explore those feelings. Thomas was gone. She was alive, and she was tired of living like a ghost. When she reached the ranch, she found Jacob in the barn mending tack. He looked up when she entered, his expression cautious. "How was church?" "Exactly as awful as I expected." Catherine closed the barn door and walked toward him, but it made me realize something. "What's that?" "That I don't care anymore. About gossip or propriety or what people think I should do." She stopped in front of him, heart pounding. "I care about you, Jacob, and I think you care about me. So why are we pretending otherwise?" Jacob set down the bridle he'd been working on. "Because I don't want you to have regrets. Because it's only been 4 months since Thomas died. Because people will say terrible things about you. Let them say whatever they want." Catherine reached for his hand. I've lost almost everything this year, my husband, my security, nearly my ranch. I'm not going to lose the chance at happiness too, just because some people think it's too soon. Catherine. Her name was a plea and a prayer on his lips. Kiss me, Jacob, and this time don't apologize for it. He did. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her like a man who'd been drowning and finally found air. Catherine kissed him back with 4 months of grief and loneliness and desperate hope. They broke apart only when breathing became necessary, both of them flushed and unsteady. I love you, Jacob said, the words rough and honest. I didn't mean to, didn't plan on it, but I do. Catherine's heart soared. I love you too. Then marry me. The question hung in the air between them. Catherine's breath caught marriage to Jacob. It was too fast, too soon, too scandalous. Everyone would say she hadn't mourned properly, that she'd dishonored Thomas's memory, that she was desperate and shameful. But when Catherine looked into Jacob's eyes, all she saw was her future. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Jacob kissed her again, gentler this time, sealing the promise between them. When they finally broke apart, he was smiling, and Catherine realized it was the first time she'd seen him look truly happy. When? He asked. Soon, before I lose my nerve. Catherine laughed, giddy with the impossibility of it all. Maybe after Christmas, that gives people time to get used to the idea. After Christmas, then. Jacob touched her face. I'll make you happy, Catherine, I swear it. You already do. They told the ranch hands that evening over supper. Sam grinned and shook Jacob's hand. Dutch clapped him on the shoulder. Henry, shy as always, just mumbled congratulations and blushed. The kitchen felt warmer somehow, full of good feeling and hope. That night, Catherine lay in bed thinking about the future. She'd be Catherine Anderson by spring. Mrs. Jacob Anderson, wife of the best foreman and now co-owner of the ranch. It was a scandal and a miracle, tragedy and triumph all tangled together. But mostly, it was hope. Christmas came with clear skies and bone-deep cold. Catherine and the men decorated the house with pine boughs and holly berries. She baked pies and cookies, filling the house with the scents of cinnamon and sugar. On Christmas morning, they all gathered in the kitchen for a special breakfast, and Jacob gave Catherine a beautiful pocket watch that had belonged to his father. I want you to have it, he said as she turned the watch over in her hands, admiring the engraving on the back. Time's precious. I don't want to waste any more of it. Catherine kissed him in front of everyone, no longer caring who saw or what they thought. This was her life, her choice, her happiness. She was done apologizing for it. They set their wedding date for January 20th, which was a Saturday. It would be a simple ceremony in the Alta Church, with Sam, Dutch, and Henry as witnesses. Catherine bought a new dress from the seamstress, dark blue wool that could be worn again rather than a frivolous white gown she'd never use. It was practical and modest, suitable for a widow's remarriage. The weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of work and preparation. The ranch was doing well despite the harsh winter. They'd lost only 2 more cows to the weather, which Jacob said was better than expected. The remaining cattle were in good shape, and the hay supply would last until spring grass came in. Catherine found herself daydreaming about the future. Running the ranch with Jacob at her side, not as employer and employee but as partners. Maybe having children someday, filling the too-quiet house with laughter and noise. Growing old together, building something that would last beyond their own lifetimes. It felt like a betrayal of Thomas sometimes. She'd loved him, mourned him, honored his memory. But life had to go on, and Catherine was tired of being sad. Jacob made her happy in ways she hadn't known she needed. He saw her strength, valued her opinions, treated her as an equal. With Thomas, she'd been a helpmate. With Jacob, she felt like a partner. The night before the wedding, Catherine sat alone in the house, thinking about the vows she'd take tomorrow. To have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death did them part. She'd said those words before, meant them with her whole heart, and then death had indeed parted them. Would it be different with Jacob? Or was she setting herself up for another heartbreak? A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. Jacob stood on the porch, looking uncertain. "Sorry to bother you. I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, but I couldn't sleep." Catherine stepped aside to let him in. "Neither could I." They sat together at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low between them. Jacob took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Because if you have doubts, I'll understand. We can call it off and I'll still stay and work the ranch. Nothing has to change if you don't want it to." Catherine squeezed his hand. "I'm sure, I'm scared, but I'm sure." She met his eyes. "I lost one husband. I'm terrified of losing another, but I'm more terrified of living the rest of my life afraid to love anyone." "I can't promise I won't die," Jacob said quietly. "Nobody can, but I promise I'll do my best to stick around. This ranch needs me. You need me. And I need you more than I've ever needed anything." "That's enough," Catherine said. "That has to be enough." They sat together in the warm kitchen, hands clasped, hearts open, facing the uncertain future together. Whatever came, they'd handle it, together. The wedding was small but meaningful. Catherine walked to the church in her new blue dress, her hair pinned up and covered with a simple bonnet. Jacob met her at the altar wearing his best suit, his hair combed back, his eyes never leaving her face. The pastor, an elderly man named Reverend Thomas, performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth. He spoke about love and commitment, about honoring the past while embracing the future, about building a life together on foundations of faith and trust. When the time came for vows, Catherine and Jacob spoke them clearly, their voices steady despite the whispers from the small congregation. "I, Catherine Eliza Walsh, take you, Jacob Michael Anderson, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. I, Jacob Michael Anderson, take you, Catherine Eliza Walsh, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." The pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and Jacob kissed his bride for the first time as her husband. The kiss was gentle, respectful, full of promise. When they turned to face the congregation, Catherine saw Mary Chen smiling and Helen Winters dabbing at her eyes. Mrs. Davies sat stone-faced in the third pew, radiating disapproval. Catherine didn't care. After the ceremony, the newlyweds and their ranch hands celebrated with dinner at the hotel restaurant. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. They ate roast beef and potatoes, drank wine, laughed at Dutch's bad jokes and Sam's stories about his cowboying days in Texas. For a few hours, they were just people enjoying each other's company, unburdened by judgment or grief. That night, Catherine and Jacob returned to the ranch as husband and wife. The house felt different somehow, warmer and more alive. They decided Jacob would move into the main house, into the bedroom that Catherine had shared with Thomas. She'd been worried it would feel wrong, but Jacob simply held her and said, "This is your house, Catherine. Our house now. We'll make new memories together and they'll be just as important as the old ones." They made love that night, slowly and carefully, learning each other's bodies, building intimacy with patience and tenderness. It was different from her wedding night with Thomas. She was older now, more experienced, less naive. And Jacob was different too, gentler than Thomas had been, more attuned to her needs. When it was over, they lay tangled together, listening to the wind howl outside, perfectly content. "I love you," Catherine whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Jacob replied, his arms tightening around her. "Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for saving my ranch, for saving me." "We saved each other," he said. "That's what partners do." Catherine smiled and closed her eyes finally, truly happy. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the land. By late February, the snows began to melt, and the cattle started venturing farther from the shelter of the hills. The ranch had survived with minimal losses, thanks to Jacob's careful management and the crew's hard work. Catherine settled into her new role as wife and partner. She and Jacob ran the ranch together, making decisions jointly, sharing the workload equally. It was a revelation to be treated as a full partner rather than a helpmate. Jacob valued her opinions, listened to her ideas, respected her knowledge. Together, they were stronger than either could have been alone. In March, they began preparations for spring branding. The cattle had produced a good crop of calves, and each one needed to be marked with the ranch brand, vaccinated and counted. It was brutal work, dusty and loud and exhausting, but also satisfying. This was the measure of their success, these bawling calves that represented the ranch's future. Sam, Dutch, and Henry worked tirelessly, roping calves and holding them while Jacob applied the brand and Catherine administered the vaccines. By the end of the first day, everyone was covered in dust and sweat, but spirits were high. The herd was healthy, the calves were strong, and the ranch was thriving. That evening, as they all sat around the dinner table eating Catherine's beef stew, Jacob made an announcement. "I've been doing the books," he said. "With the calves we've got this year, we should be able to clear a good profit at market, enough to pay back wages, restock supplies, and maybe even start improvements on the barn." Sam whistled low. "That's good news, boss. It means we all did our jobs right," Jacob said. "Every one of us. This ranch is a success because we worked together." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Less than a year ago, she'd been standing in the yard watching the bank take everything. Now she had a thriving ranch, loyal workers, and a husband who loved her. It felt like a miracle. In April, they drove the cattle to market in Salt Lake City. It was a grueling 3-day journey, pushing 200 head through mountain passes and across rivers still swollen with snowmelt. But the cattle arrived in good condition, and the buyers were impressed with the quality of the stock. Jacob negotiated hard, refusing to accept less than what the cattle were worth. In the end, they sold the entire herd for nearly $7,000, far more than Catherine had dared hope. After paying off their debts and settling accounts, they still had over $3,000 profit. "We should use some of this to buy more breeding stock," Jacob said as they sat in the hotel room counting their money. "Build the herd bigger for next year." "And pay you back," Catherine added. "You've loaned me almost $5,000. It's time I started repaying that debt." "Catherine, we're married now. What's mine is yours. That debt doesn't exist anymore." "It exists to me," Catherine said firmly. "You invested in this ranch before we were married when you had no obligation to do so. I want to repay that investment with interest." They argued about it for an hour before finally compromising. Catherine would pay Jacob back over time, but without interest, and only after the ranch's needs were met. It satisfied neither of them completely, which meant it was probably a fair solution. They returned to the ranch in early May, bringing with them 50 head of new breeding stock and enough supplies to last through the next winter. The other ranchers in the valley took notice. Catherine Walsh, the widow everyone had written off, had not only survived but thrived. Her ranch was one of the most successful in the territory. The gossip about her hasty remarriage faded, replaced by grudging respect. Even Mrs. Davies managed to be civil when they encountered each other in town, though her disapproval still simmered beneath the surface. Catherine didn't care. She had everything she needed. Summer brought long days and hard work. They expanded the pastures, repaired the barn, dug a new well. Jacob hired 2 additional ranch hands to help with the increased workload. The ranch was growing, becoming something bigger than Catherine had ever imagined. In July, Catherine realized she'd missed her monthly courses. At first, she thought it was stress or hard work throwing off her cycle, but when 2 months passed without bleeding, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. She told Jacob one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. He'd been talking about plans for fall roundup when Catherine interrupted him. "Jacob, I'm going to have a baby." He stopped mid-sentence, his mouth falling open. "What? I'm pregnant. About 2 months along, I think." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, then a smile spread across his face, transforming it into something radiant. "We're going to have a baby." "We're going to have a baby," Catherine confirmed, laughing at his expression. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I can't believe it. A baby. Our baby." They sat together on the porch, making plans and dreaming dreams, talking about names and nurseries and all the ways their lives were about to change. Catherine felt joy bubble up inside her, pure and uncomplicated. After everything she'd lost, she was being given something new. Someone new. The pregnancy was relatively easy. Catherine continued working on the ranch, though Jacob and the hands insisted she avoid heavy lifting and strenuous activity. Her body changed, growing round with new life. She felt the baby move for the first time in September, a flutter like butterfly wings against her ribs. Jacob was fascinated by her changing body, his hands constantly drifting to her belly, feeling for kicks and movement. In October, Catherine traveled to Salt Lake City to see a proper doctor. He examined her and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. The baby would arrive sometime in mid-February, he estimated. Catherine returned to the ranch with a renewed sense of wonder. In 6 months, she'd be a mother. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. Winter came again, but this time Catherine faced it without fear. The ranch was secure. The cattle were healthy, and she had Jacob beside her. They spent the long winter evenings preparing for the baby, sewing blankets and diapers, building a cradle, discussing names. If it was a boy, they'd name him Thomas, after Catherine's first husband. If it was a girl, Sarah, after Jacob's lost sister. Both names honored the past while celebrating the future. Catherine went into labor on a snowy February morning. The contractions started before dawn, waking her with sharp pains that stole her breath. Jacob immediately sent Dutch to fetch the doctor from Alta, then helped Catherine into bed and held her hand through each contraction. The labor lasted 14 hours. Jacob stayed with her the entire time, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, supporting her when she needed to walk, speaking words of encouragement when the pain became almost unbearable. The doctor arrived around noon and took over, efficient and calm. "You're doing well, Mrs. Anderson," he said, examining her between contractions. "The baby's in a good position. It won't be long now." He was right. As the sun set that evening, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The doctor placed the squalling infant on her chest, and Catherine looked down at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. He was perfect, tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. "Hello, Thomas," she whispered, touching his downy head. "Welcome to the world." Jacob stood beside the bed, his face wet with tears. "He's beautiful. You're beautiful." He kissed Catherine's forehead, then carefully touched his son's tiny hand. Thomas's fingers closed around Jacob's thumb, gripping with surprising strength. "He's strong," Jacob said, wonder in his voice. "Look at that grip." The doctor finished his work and left, promising to check on them in a few days. Sam, Dutch, and Henry came to the house to meet the new arrival, each of them awkward and sweet with congratulations. Then they retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving the new family alone. That night, Catherine lay in bed with her husband on one side and her newborn son in a cradle on the other. Thomas slept peacefully, making the small snuffling sounds that newborns make. Jacob held Catherine's hand, both of them too awed to sleep. "Thank you," Jacob said quietly. "For this." "For him, for everything. Thank you for giving me a reason to keep fighting," Catherine replied. "A year ago I thought my life was over. Now look at us." "Now look at us," Jacob echoed, smiling. They stayed awake most of that night, watching their son sleep, marveling at the miracle they'd created together. The ranch outside was quiet and cold, but inside, the house was warm with love and new life. The months after Thomas's birth were exhausting but joyful. Catherine learned to navigate motherhood, waking every few hours to nurse the baby, changing endless diapers, soothing him when he cried. Jacob helped whenever he could, walking the floor with his son when Catherine needed sleep, changing diapers without complaint, singing off key lullabies that somehow worked. The ranch hands were surprisingly good with the baby. Sam carved him wooden toys. Dutch made a mobile for the cradle. Henry was terrified of holding him at first, but once he worked up the courage, he was surprisingly gentle. The house that had once been so quiet now rang with baby cries and laughter. By the time Thomas was 6 months old, he was a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and everything. Catherine took him with her when she did chores around the ranch, carrying him in a sling against her chest. He'd watch the cattle with wide eyes, reaching out chubby hands as if trying to grab them. The ranch continued to prosper. The herd had grown to over 300 head, and they'd hired 2 more permanent ranch hands to help manage the workload. Jacob and Catherine talked about building a proper house, something bigger than the cabin, with more bedrooms for the children they hoped to have. In the fall, they broke ground on the new house. It would take a year to build, but when finished, it would be substantial, a house that could shelter generations. They designed it together, incorporating all the features they'd dreamed about, a large kitchen with modern appliances, a parlor for entertaining, 4 bedrooms upstairs, a wraparound porch perfect for watching sunsets. As the house took shape, Catherine often stood watching the construction with Thomas in her arms. "This is your legacy," she'd whisper to him. "Your father and I built this for you so you'd always have a home, so you'd always know you were loved." The following spring, when Thomas was just over a year old, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was less of a surprise but no less joyful. Jacob was delighted at the prospect of another child. Thomas was walking now, getting into everything, and Jacob said he needed a sibling to keep him busy. This pregnancy was harder than the first. Catherine was exhausted caring for a toddler while growing another baby, but she had help. Jacob hired a young woman named Emma from town to assist with household duties and childcare. Emma was 18, practical and cheerful, and she adored Thomas. Her presence made Catherine's life significantly easier. In December, as snow fell softly outside the new house they just moved into, Catherine gave birth to a daughter. The labor was faster this time, only 6 hours, and the baby girl came into the world with a lusty cry that announced her presence to everyone within earshot. "Sarah," Catherine said as the doctor placed the baby in her arms. "Sarah Catherine Anderson." Jacob kissed his wife and daughter, his heart so full he thought it might burst. 2 children, a thriving ranch, a beautiful new house, a wife he adored. Life had given him more than he'd ever dared hope for. "You've made me the happiest man alive," he told Catherine, stroking Sarah's dark hair. "You've made me whole again," Catherine replied. "You took a broken widow and gave her a reason to live. I'll never stop being grateful for that." The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning ranching from the ground up. Sarah was quieter but equally strong-willed, with her mother's determination and her father's patience. 2 years after Sarah's birth, Catherine had another son they named William, and 3 years after that, twin girls, Grace and Hope. The ranch expanded to over 1,000 acres. They ran 500 head of cattle and had built a reputation for quality stock throughout the territory. Sam retired and went to live with his daughter in Denver, but Dutch and Henry stayed on, eventually becoming partners in the operation. New ranch hands came and went, but the core of the operation remained stable. Jacob and Catherine grew older together, weathering droughts and harsh winters, celebrating good years and surviving bad ones. They watched their children grow, helping them with schoolwork, teaching them to ride, instilling in them the values of hard work and integrity. They sat on their porch in the evenings, gray-haired and content, watching grandchildren play in the yard where Catherine had once stood alone. Losing everything on their 20th anniversary, Jacob gave Catherine a locket containing photographs of all 5 children. "20 years ago, I rode up to this ranch and saw a woman who refused to give up," he said, fastening the locket around her neck. "That woman changed my life, gave it meaning and purpose, made me understand what it means to build something that lasts." Catherine touched the locket, tears in her eyes. "You saved me, Jacob, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," he corrected, pulling her close. "That's what partners do." They kissed on the porch of the house they'd built together, surrounded by the ranch they'd saved together, secure in the love they'd fought for together. It had started with a bank taking everything and a cowboy buying it back. It had grown into something far bigger and more beautiful than either could have imagined. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Catherine stood on her porch watching her grandchildren play. Thomas, her firstborn, now ran the day-to-day operations of the ranch with his father. Sarah was married to a neighboring rancher's son, expecting her 3rd child. William was studying veterinary medicine in Salt Lake City. The twins, still just 14, were inside helping Emma prepare supper. Jacob came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist in the familiar way he'd done for 20 years. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Catherine leaned against him, feeling the solid strength that had sustained her through 2 decades. "I'm thinking about that morning 20 years ago when I thought I'd lost everything. How terrified I was, how alone I felt. And now I know I never really lost anything that mattered. I lost cattle and land, but I found you. I lost security, but I gained strength. I lost one life and built another, better one." She turned to face him. "The bank took my cattle and my dignity that afternoon. You bought both back, but what you really gave me was hope, a future, a family, love." Jacob kissed her forehead. "You gave me the same things, a home, a purpose. A reason to stop drifting and start building." They stood together as darkness fell, listening to the sounds of their ranch, their family, their life, cattle lowing in the distance, children laughing inside, the evening wind moving through the pines. It was the music of home, hard-won and precious. Catherine thought about everything they'd survived together. Harsh winters and financial struggles, illness and injury, the death of loved ones and the birth of new life. Through it all, they'd stood together, partners in every sense of the word. The church ladies had been wrong about her. She hadn't dishonored Thomas's memory by remarrying quickly. She'd honored his dream of keeping the ranch alive, and she'd done it by accepting help from a man who'd become so much more than a hired hand. Jacob hadn't taken advantage of a desperate widow. He'd given her the tools to save herself, then stood beside her while she did it. Their story wasn't a scandal. It was a love story. The best kind, built on mutual respect and shared dreams, strengthened by hardship and sweetened by joy. As they walked back into the house, Catherine took one last look at the ranch spread out before her. Every fence line, every building, every head of cattle represented hours of work, gallons of sweat, endless determination. But more than that, it represented love, the love of a husband for his wife, the love of parents for their children, the love of people who refused to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. Inside, the table was set for a family dinner. Their children and grandchildren gathered around, talking and laughing, filling the house with life. Emma brought out platters of food. Jacob said grace, thanking God for blessings too numerous to count. They ate together, a family built from loss and love, thriving in the wild land they'd claimed as home. That night, after everyone had gone to their respective homes and beds, Catherine and Jacob prepared for sleep. They'd shared this bedroom for 20 years, and the routine was comfortable, familiar. Jacob hung up his clothes while Catherine brushed her hair. They moved around each other with the ease of long practice, each anticipating the other's needs. When they finally lay down, Jacob pulled Catherine close, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. It was steady and strong, the rhythm that had sustained her through 2 decades of life. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Catherine asked. "When you offered to buy back my cattle." "I said a lot of things that day. You said you'd been looking for somewhere to light for a while, that this could work for both of us." She smiled against his chest. "You were right." "I usually am," Jacob said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Catherine poked him in the ribs. "Don't get cocky. I'm the one who decided to take a chance on a stranger with too much money and questionable motives. Best decision you ever made." "Second best," Catherine corrected. "The best decision was saying yes when you proposed." They fell silent, comfortable in each other's arms. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Inside, the house was warm and secure. Catherine thought about all the storms they'd weathered together, all the challenges they'd overcome. She thought about the children sleeping in their own beds, the grandchildren who'd grow up knowing the ranch their grandparents built. She thought about legacy and love, and the beautiful, unpredictable journey that had brought her here. "Jacob, thank you for everything. For seeing me when I was invisible, for believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself, for loving me when I felt unlovable." His arms tightened around her. "You were never invisible, Catherine, never unlovable. You were strong and beautiful and determined, and I fell in love with you the moment I saw you standing on that porch, refusing to give up." He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, for seeing past the drifter to the man I wanted to become, for building this life with me." "I'd do it all again," Catherine whispered. "Every hard day, every struggle, every moment of fear and doubt, because it all led here to this moment in this house with you beside me." "Me too," Jacob said. "Me too." They drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms, their breathing synchronizing the way it had every night for 20 years. Outside, the ranch settled into nighttime quiet. The cattle slept in the pastures. The horses dozed in the barn. The chickens roosted in their coops. Everything was peaceful, ordered, right. And in the master bedroom of the big house on the hill, the woman who'd lost everything and the man who'd helped her find it again slept peacefully, their love a testament to the enduring power of hope, determination, and second chances. Years later, when Catherine was an old woman with white hair and grandchildren grown, she'd tell this story to anyone who'd listen. She'd talk about the morning the bank came, about the cowboy who'd appeared like something out of a dream, about the ranch they'd built, and the love they'd found. She'd tell it as a love story, because that's what it was. Not the conventional kind, not the kind the church ladies approved of, but real and true and lasting. And when she was very old, lying in bed with Jacob's hand in hers, she'd think about that scared young widow standing in the yard, watching her life disappear. She'd want to tell that woman not to be afraid, that help was coming, that love was coming, that everything would work out better than she could possibly imagine. But the young widow would have to learn those lessons herself, the way Catherine had. Through faith and fear, through darkness and dawn, through loss that became gain and endings that became beginnings. She'd have to stand alone in the yard and watch the bank take everything, because only then would she be ready to accept what the cowboy was offering. Not just cattle and land, but hope, partnership, love. The bank had taken her cattle and her dignity that afternoon. A cowboy had bought both back. But what they'd built together, what they'd created from loss and love and sheer stubborn determination, that was worth more than any dollar amount. That was priceless. That was forever. And on the ranch in Alta, Utah, where aspens turned gold every autumn and snow blanketed the mountains every winter, where cattle grazed on good land and children played in green meadows, the story lived on. Not as a scandal or a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the resilience of the human heart, the power of second chances, and the enduring truth that sometimes the worst day of your life leads directly to the best. Catherine Walsh Anderson lived to be 87 years old. Jacob lived to be 90. They died within months of each other, having spent 50 years together, having raised 5 children who gave them 18 grandchildren and countless great-grandchildren. The ranch they saved together remained in the family for generations, a legacy of love built on foundations of hope and hard work. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind came down from the mountains, people said you could see 2 figures on the porch of the big house, sitting side by side, watching the sunset together the way they had for 50 years. The woman who'd refused to give up and the man who'd given her a reason to keep fighting, together forever on the land they'd loved and the ranch they'd saved. Their story a reminder that sometimes salvation comes not from giving in to despair, but from accepting help from unexpected places, and that love, real love, is always worth taking a chance on, no matter what anyone else might say.